Okay, so today's lesson is looking at methods of disease transmission. Learning intentions are identify direct and indirect methods of transmission of pathogens and identify strategies to help control the spread of disease. So the first method of transmission we're going to look at here is indirect, and the first type we're looking at is contaminated surfaces. Any surface that someone touches and leaves behind some pathogens, and then someone else comes along and touches that surface and picks up the pathogen from the surface, well, that's indirect. They didn't have to contact the person directly, but indirectly that pathogen was passed on. So you're looking at anything like eating utensils that have been shared, sharing a drink bottle, even just touching taps or doorknobs that someone else has touched. These two here are pretty disgusting, but a handkerchief, bed sheets, a handkerchief, if anyone's not sure what that is, it's like a cloth tissue that people blow their nose into and then stuff back in their pockets and use it over and over again, which is disgusting in itself. I don't know who would want to share someone's handkerchief, but it's a pretty good example of how you can actually pick up a disease from some sort of contaminated surface. Bed sheets, yeah, again, it's not very hygienic, but I guess if you're sharing bed sheets, you might be able to pick up a pathogen if you're unlucky enough. Mobile phones, etc. You name it. Any surface that this pathogen can survive on, and then someone else comes along and touches, we call that indirect transmission via a contaminated surface. The flu and the cold, those viruses are pretty classic examples there of a virus that can survive on a surface for a period of time, long enough for someone to come along and touch it and actually catch that particular disease. The next method here is airborne, which is a little bit scary. If the microorganisms can remain in the air for long periods of time, then they can be passed from person to person indirectly. Measles, tuberculosis, chickenpox, classic examples of airborne diseases. The scary thing about these is you don't actually have to come into contact with someone. You don't even have to be sneezed at in the face. You could actually just be across the room from them and had nothing to do with them, and the pathogen has floated through the air, and you've breathed it in and become infected. So airborne is highly contagious as far as an indirect method of transmission. Insects or other animals can carry a disease and pass it on to people indirectly. So malaria, bubonic plague, Lyme disease by ticks. We can have food and water as well. So contaminated water sources, unsanitary food handling procedures. So you're not washing your hands, for instance. You're not boiling water, so there's pathogens in the water itself that you're going to ingest. Undercooked meat also could have pathogens in it, some bacteria in it. You need to cook it to kill the pathogens. So any unsanitary food handling procedures, undercooking of meat, contaminated water would come under this umbrella term of indirect transmission of disease. So food poisoning like salmonella and cholera, if it's contaminated water, classic examples of diseases passed via that method. And obviously, you've got cuts and wounds. So if you have a chink in your armor, your skin is now broken, that first line of defense, well, that's a fantastic way for pathogens to invade your body. Tetanus. This guy down here, this is an old painting of a tetanus victim, so to speak, who's kind of turning himself backwards like a paperclip. Tetanus, bacteria, will get in through your cut or your wound and infect you indirectly. So they're all indirect methods of transmission. Make sure that you've got these main headings down here and you've got a couple of examples of each of those surfaces and maybe one or two of these diseases as well. Okay, let's have a look at some direct methods of transmission. So this is when you have direct physical contact via person-to-person contact, such as touching someone, shaking hands, for instance, kissing, sexual contact with an infected person are all considered direct methods of transmission. For example, sexually transmitted infections or STIs, glandular fever, the AIDS virus as well could be considered direct physical contact, and droplets are considered direct as well. So this is when you sneeze or cough. I'm sure you'd never do that, but if you sneeze or cough directly on a person, viruses such as the common cold or influenza can be transmitted directly from person to person via these guys here. Have a look here. All these little droplets containing viruses, bacteria, you name it, there's pathogens all through that, and this poor person off the screen out there somewhere is coughing a face full of that guy's droplets. So that's direct contact, different to airborne, where these viruses or pathogens will just float through the air by themselves and cover quite a distance. This is direct because it's actually this guy's saliva and phlegm that's being projected onto someone else. So we consider that direct method of transmission. So when we talk about patterns of disease, there's three patterns that we need to get our head around. And the first one down here is an endemic disease. This is when a disease is present at low levels all the time. So the common cold, for instance, you can never get rid of it. The common cold is always there in the population. It's at fairly low levels, but if it's endemic, it's kind of hard to get rid of. We just live with it. It's at low levels in the community all the time. If we have an epidemic, probably heard that before, this is where we have an increase in the prevalence of a disease to a national level, spreading rapidly through a population and affecting a high volume of people. So unlike endemic, which is just present at low levels all the time, this is when on a national level you have high volumes of people, you have rapid spreading of the disease. We'd consider that an epidemic. Beyond that, you'll have a pandemic, and I think we know all about that by now over the last year and a half. Rapid spread of a disease throughout the world. You have multiple continents and countries infected. You have massive amounts of people infected globally if it's to be considered a pandemic. So we're going to look at some personal measures that we can undertake to help mitigate or stop or prevent the spread of these diseases. And I've got to say, you guys should be, this will be no surprise to you what these measures are, considering what we're living through at the moment. I don't even know if I have to reveal these for you. See if you can, you know what, actually, see if you can have a guess at some strategies to control the spread of disease, personal measures. We've even got pictures here to give you guys a hand. I'm going to give you some thinking time here. I dare you to write down two strategies that we can undertake. Okay, let's move on. What do we got? Hygiene practices, cooking food properly, protective barriers such as gloves and condoms. Cover your mouth and nose when coughing and sneezing. Vaccinations, insect repellent, use chemical controls, disinfectants, and antiseptics. Hygiene practices. Wash your hands. Get rid of the pathogens. Cooking food properly. Kill the pathogens. Destroy them via heat. Use protective barriers such as gloves. So this is protective, but this is just physical barriers. Just get nice and simple with it. Physical barriers. Cover your mouth and nose when coughing and sneezing. Yeah, that's a physical barrier, and it should be inside of elbow. Why? Correct, because if you sneeze on your hand, you're going to go and shake someone's hand, and you've got a hand covered in phlegm and spit with pathogens all the way through it, so you're going to pass it on to someone. So inside of the elbow is best. You're not really shaking hands with people with the inside of your elbow, so less chance that you're going to transmit it. Vaccinations, need I say more? You guys should be pretty confident in understanding what a vaccination is now. Insect repellent, this is, I guess, chemical warfare here against those mosquitoes or ticks that are carrying diseases, and chemical controls, disinfectants and antiseptics, so that'd be chemical warfare too. So just cleaning up surfaces like so and getting rid of pathogens on those surfaces before anyone touches it, before you prepare any food. These are all personal measures that we can undertake. Community measures to prevent or mitigate or control the spread of disease. Again, what are we doing right now? We're all sitting at home because COVID is running rampant throughout the world, throughout Australia, and it's starting to creep into Brisbane. What are some things we're doing as a community to prevent the spread of COVID? I'll give you some thinking time. I won't give you thinking music. It's a bit weird, but I'm going to give you some time to think. Write a couple down. Pictures to help you. By the way, this picture is what not to do. All right, let's have a look here. See how many you got. Contact tracing and quarantine. Here's an example over here of the CDC, Center for Disease Control. And this is their plan for contact tracing people who have Ebola. Contact tracing is basically finding out if someone's infected, where have they been, who have they spoken to. That's why you keep seeing these exposure sites on TV at the news at night, because contact tracers are saying, where have you been in the last 2 days? We need to know. Now, all of a sudden, that particular chemist in Baden becomes, and by the way, I don't know if there is a chemist in Baden, so I just made that one up, but there's a site now that if you've been there, you're possibly a close contact, and you may have had the disease transmitted to you. So contact tracing, people who are infected, where have they been, who could they have passed it on to? Quarantine, if you're sick, you stay at home, you don't see anyone, you don't touch anyone, and hopefully, oh, look, you're sick, that's unfortunate, but hopefully you don't pass it on to anyone else. School and workplace closures, same deal. We're all at home now because, well, number one, if anyone's sick, we don't want to pass it on. Number two, if you're healthy, you don't want to catch it. So we basically remove all, as much as we can, remove contact from other people. Reduction of mass gatherings. So this, like I said, this is what not to do. That's why we don't have the ECA next week. We don't want people in close proximity passing on diseases, which is fairly self-explanatory. Can you imagine COVID, the Delta variant, going rampant through this crowd here? It would be all over. Temperature screening. So at airports, this is pretty common. They'll actually look at people's temperature. If you have an elevated temperature, that means you have a fever. And as you guys know, the second line of defense, you'll actually get a fever as your body's way of trying to destroy or reduce the ability of that bacteria or virus to reproduce. And we'll be able to pick that fever up on these thermal cameras here, pull you aside, put you into quarantine. So these are community measures to help control the spread of a disease. Last one we've got is travel restrictions. So this could be stuff like border closures. Borders opening, borders closing, border closures. Well, no international travel. That's gone. No international travel. Most of this is about stopping infected people coming into contact with healthy people and vice versa. Stopping healthy people hooking up or meeting with people who are infected. That's the idea of these community measures. So that's it for this lesson. We've had a look at your direct and indirect methods of transmission. Make sure you can list a couple of each of those methods from direct and indirect, and have a couple of examples of diseases that are transmitted via those methods. That's something that you should probably get your head around before we move on. We've also had a look at different measures to help control the spread of disease. So understand what these community measures are, have a couple of these that you can call upon, and also think about those personal practices that we have. And it shouldn't be too hard. Again, seeing as we're living through this right now, what are we doing in our daily life? What are the people what's the health officer telling us to do every night? It shouldn't be too hard to remember this kind of stuff. And that is all we need to do for this particular topic.